How often do we tie our motivation to the prize? If the post performs well, I'll keep creating. If the client praises me, I'll keep pushing. If the economy improves, I'll take the risk. If I get recognized, I'll try harder. How often do we quietly say, I'm just not good at that? Sales, money, boundaries, hard conversations, leadership. We call it self awareness. But sometimes I really think it's just fear. Welcome to Badass Softy, a podcast for leaders who are unapologetically ambitious and want to lead with heart because you're allowed to chase big goals without losing what makes you human. I'm your host, Dr. JJ Peterson, and this week, my son came home from school and I was kind of doing the typical parent thing where I go through his backpack and I'm looking at folders and seeing things that I probably should have signed 3 days ago to go back to school. And I found this sheet that started talking about how last week the readathon started. The readathon, it's a big deal. The readathon's a big deal. And I was a little surprised we hadn't talked about it or I hadn't heard about it because he loves it. I mean, he will sometimes read 2 to 3 hours a night during the readathon. Now, he's a strong reader. In fact, if you ask him what he wants to be when he grows up, he says he wants to be an author. So he reads a lot. And, becoming an author is obviously melts this author dad's heart. But when it comes to the readathon, I mean, he goes next level. And I was just surprised he hadn't mentioned it. And so I asked him, why didn't you start reading for the readathon? Or did you? And we didn't talk about it. And he said, with a little bit of disdain in his voice, have you looked at the prizes? So I looked at the paper and I have to be honest, he was right. The prizes were not great. There was like a pen or a little notebook, this like squishy toy. And he goes, do they really expect me to read for 3 hours for that? Because you can buy it for 50 cents. And then he says, when they told us what the prizes were, Alex and I went, boo. I have to admit, I had to stop myself from laughing and, because that's funny. But I put on my parent voice and my parent face and I was like, hey, did you really boo? And he said, yes. And so, of course, we had to have a conversation first about respect because he really shouldn't be booing anyone, let alone his teacher, maybe especially his teacher. But also, I wanted to say his teacher didn't have to buy those prizes to begin with. She could have just said, if you don't read for 40 minutes a night, you're going to get an F. Or she could have just said, hey, you read or not, like you're going to, if you want to be good, read, The prizes were not required. They were kindness. They were positive motivation. So booing them, while funny in theory, was not the move. But the conversation then shifted. I wanted to talk a little bit more deeply about this because what I realized is he had attached his motivation to reading to those prizes, and that was not what he usually did. I was like, buddy, you love reading. You're good at reading. You want to be an author. Why are you suddenly pretending you need a keychain or a rubber bracelet to read? And we started talking about motivation and about finding it from the inside. And I think he just kind of got sick of me talking about it. And so after a while, he kind of pivoted and he's like, well, it's hard. He started making an excuse. In second grade, I read more picture books and now I have to read books with less pictures. And I was like, boo. No, I didn't. First off, I know the whole reading is hard thing is not true. But I wanted to have a deeper conversation about the idea of where does your motivation come from? And I didn't want to let it go. And I wanted to say but you have to motivate. And also, even if it is hard, you have to figure out how to grow in your reading. And before I realized it, I was having a full-on conversation about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And I was talking to my 9-year-old about internal locus of control versus external locus of control with my 9-year-old. With my 9-year-old, I'm having this whole conversation. And I wanted to have this conversation because I learned about these things a few years ago and they changed my life. And it actually changed the way even I parent him. And this conversation was reminding me why these ideas are so important. And so I want to talk to him about this, but now I want to talk about these things here. So I want to start with this idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Something I learned that I want to share. This language comes from the psychologist Carol Dweck at Stanford. She talks about how a fixed mindset believes that intelligence and abilities are static. You either have it or you don't. You're good at math or you're not. You're creative or you're not. You're a leader or you're not. It's all static, it's set. That's what fixed mindset is. Whereas a growth mindset believes abilities can be developed through effort and learning and persistence. So you may not be good at it yet, but you can get better. And that little tiny word is what matters most. Yet. There was a large national study where researchers gave high school freshmen a short online lesson about how the brain actually grows. It was only about 30 minutes. It wasn't a big, long thing, but they taught students that when something feels hard, it doesn't mean that you're dumb. It means your brain is actually building new connections, new neural pathways. They even had students, after learning about this, write letters to younger kids explaining how effort can actually change the brain. And, that small shift in how those students interpreted struggle, it actually led to measurable improvements in grades, especially for the kids who had been underperforming. Because the belief that growth was possible changed how they behaved. There was another study where kids were given puzzles and then praised in different ways. Some were told, "You are so smart." And then others were told, "You must have worked really hard." So the kids who were praised for being smart chose easier puzzles the next time because they didn't want to risk not being smart again. But the kids who were praised for their effort chose harder puzzles and actually stuck with them longer. When effort was praised, that was the win, and growth then became the goal. In other words, when we believe we can grow, we behave differently. We try, we risk, we stick with it. And here's kind of what then that brought up in me. What I kind of think is interesting is I think that fixed mindset often shows up in a way that sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like I know who I am because a fixed mindset says, I'm not good at sales. Put anything in there. I'm not good at blank. Or I'm not a numbers person. I'm bad at conflict. I'm not creative. I don't do tech. When you say those things enough times, it's not just like self-awareness. It really becomes an identity. And identity is very hard to challenge. That's fixed mindset. Growth mindset says, I'm not good at this yet. I haven't practiced the skills enough. I get uncomfortable here, so I need repetition. I need reps. It shifts the story from something being fixed or permanent to it's about the process. Now, in regards to my son, here's where, for me, it gets even more interesting. There's another psychological concept called locus of control. This comes from psychologist Julian Rotter. Locus of control is where you believe control lives. So does control live internal? Is control inside of you, or is it about things that are outside of you? Because external locus of control says my outcomes are mostly determined by outside forces, like the teacher or the prize. That determines my effort. Or in business, the economy, the boss, luck. It's about things that are outside of you are in control. An internal locus of control says my effort matters, my response matters. It doesn't mean you control everything. It means you believe you have influence. The most successful people in the world have a combination of internal locus of control, what I do matters, and a growth mindset. With my son, the thought was, that the prizes were lame, so he didn't need to try. But what I really wanted him to understand was this. If your motivation is always external, your effort will always be conditional, right? Oh, it doesn't matter what I do because whatever I do, it just ends up blank. If the prize is good, I try. If the recognition is loud, I show up. If the applause is immediate, I persist. Or, well, if they're there, I'm not going to try. If that boss is around, I'm not going to do anything. But when your control is internal, inside of you, it says, I read because I want to grow. I write because I want to get better. I practice because I care about mastery. And that's a completely different fuel source. And as leaders, this is so critical because at some point, the prices are not great. The market does not clap. The post does not go viral. The client does not respond. The raise doesn't come when you think it should. If your mindset is fixed and externally driven, then that's when you quit. You're done. You're capped. Fixed mindset and external locus of control means capped. It means done. Growth mindset and internal locus of control, well, they're not the same thing. They work beautifully together because growth mindset says, I can get better. And internal locus of control says, what I do actually matters. That's when you find success. That's when you find joy. That's when you find growth. Fixed mindset says, this is just who I am. External locus of control says, whether I win or lose mostly depends on the circumstances or the people outside of me. You know, like I said, it sounds like this. It's like, I'm not good at sales and the market is terrible anyway. Have you heard you say that? Or have you said that even in your own head? I'm just bad at conflict and my team would never change. I'm not creative and the algorithm decides who succeeds anyway. It's all about the algorithm. It's not about what I do. Whereas growth mindset with an internal focus sounds different. It says, I'm not good at sales yet, so I need reps. I'm uncomfortable with conflict, so I actually need to seek help, or I need to have these conversations more often, more intentionally. The market may be tough, but I can control how I show up. The algorithm may be crazy, but I can still create habits of creating content. One mindset locks identity and gives away power. The other builds capacity and takes ownership. That's the difference. So again, back to my son. When he looked at those prizes and said, boo, what he really was saying was, if the reward's not good enough, I'm not motivated. That's external locus of control. When he later said, it's too hard, I can't read, that's a whisper of fixed mindset. If it feels hard, maybe I'm not good at it. If I'm not good at it, then why try? And what I wanted him to understand was this. You don't read for the prize. You read because you want to become an author, and you have the ability to make that happen. Every page is practice. Every chapter is training. And yes, here's the truth. Sometimes it's hard. That doesn't mean you can't. It means you need to be stretched a little bit. So now let's just bring it back to us. How often do we tie our motivation to the prize? If the post performs well, I'll keep creating. If the client praises me, I'll keep pushing. If the economy improves, I'll take the risk. If I get recognized, I'll try harder. How often do we quietly say, I'm just not good at that? Sales, money, boundaries, hard conversations, leadership. We call it self-awareness. But sometimes I really think it's just fear. Or maybe even lately in my case, fatigue. I'm just tired. If I'm honest, I'm just tired. And then we kind of decide we're done growing because it's hard. Growth mindset with an internal locus of control is powerful because it says I can develop and my effort matters. That's so important when it comes to life and leadership. This combination of I can develop and my effort matters is what creates resilient leaders, period. Leaders who don't wait for better prizes and leaders who are not derailed by difficulty, and if you lead people, especially, I think your mindset becomes culture. If you blame everything external, like you shift the blame away from you and put it on things that are outside of your control, your team will too. But if you admit that you're still learning and then keep practicing, you actually end up creating psychological safety. You create a culture where growth is normal. So here's, I think, the question for all of us this week. It's pretty simple. Where have you given up your motivation because things felt outside of your control? Where have you quietly decided something about yourself that might not actually be permanent? Because you're not done growing and your effort still matters. And so before I go, let me leave you with this. May you find the motivation that does not depend on the prize. May you stretch without deciding you're broken. May you keep turning the pages even when the prizes deserve a good boo. May you chase growth so boldly that the winds can't help but follow. And may you become the kind of leader who can win without losing yourself. Because we believe you can be both kind and ambitious, fun and driven, powerful and deeply human. Your leadership can inspire, your success can have soul, and your ambition can make space for everyone. That's why you're a badass softie. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening. Follow and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. BadassSoftie.com is crafted by Fruitful Design and Strategy.